Hello, welcome to SIEPR, everyone. I'm Mark Duggan. I'm the Trione Director of SIEPR, and I'm really thrilled that Maya MacGuineas is going to be speaking at our first Associates Meeting of the academic year. Maya is the President of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, which is, it's been pretty responsible lately, right? That organization in many ways embodies what we're trying to accomplish here at SIEPR. Nonpartisan, unbiased economic policy analysis is really at the core of what we are trying to do, and making sure that analysis gets onto the radar screen of policymakers and the public is really essential to our mission. We're kicking off an exciting, this is the first week of the 2018-19 academic year here at Stanford, and we're kicking it off with a big focus on another one of our really important goals, which is preparing the next generation of economic policymakers and scholars. We do that through our undergraduate research assistant program and by supporting graduate students along with pre-doctoral fellows who are between their undergraduate and graduate studies. And we're doing lots of things, and all of that research and teaching and opportunity that we're trying to create is largely supported by the philanthropy from many of you and our other friends at SIEPR. And so all of us here are really, really grateful for this support that you've been providing this past year and for many, many years. And here, my role and all of us at SIEPR try to bring you great speakers like today's who can share with you their insights into some of the biggest economic policy issues. And I think the issues that we're going to talk about today are at or near the top of the list of issues we're facing here in the US. But just before getting to today's, just in a few weeks, I want to give you a preview. We're going to be having a policy forum that's focused on the challenges that are ahead for the next governor of California. So on November 2nd, on Friday, November 2nd, we're going to have a day-long event where we're going to sort of zoom in on many different topics, and including the tax code and housing costs, those easy to solve things. Soon after that, a couple weeks later, we'll hear from Steve Nelson, who is the CEO of United Healthcare, which is the largest health insurer in the US. We have many more events, but I'm also delighted to share with you that we've lined up to be the keynote speaker at our summit, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell. So I think it's going to be a great year, 2018-19, and we're kicking it off here. And I'm really happy and honored to be hosting Maya MacGuineas, who is going to be sharing some important insights into our federal government's fiscal position today and in the coming years. And today is the first time I met Maya, I think, 2 hours ago. But I've been following her and the work that CRFB are doing for a long time. And I'm delighted also that she was able to meet with a bunch of our students before coming here to talk a bit about her own experience as our students try to think about how to optimize their decision making in the years ahead. As the president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, Maya oversees an organization dedicated to working with politicians on both sides of the political aisle to help them develop policies that will improve the country's fiscal and economic condition. And I think the committee plays a really important role as kind of a government watchdog, working closely with journalists and other organizations to bring greater accountability to the federal budgeting process. I get lots of emails. You guys do a lot. You produce a lot of stuff. So I'm very amazed by how much work comes out of your organization. But they, just as an example, they were prominently cited in today's front page story in the New York Times that focused on the overwhelming interest that the government is paying on its debt. So in this article, basically they pointed out that the interest on the federal debt over the next decade is going to triple from about $300 billion today to about $900 billion by 2028. It's hard to forecast exactly, but their research, and it was coincidentally, that story was coincidentally written by Nelson Schwartz, who we hosted here at SIEPR earlier this year as one of our first media fellows. But over the years, Maya has picked up a few labels that seem to suit her well. The Wall Street Journal has called her an anti-deficit warrior. And in an interview with the Washington Post last year, she referred to her tough role of being the fiscal skunk at every party. So that plays to her very important position in Washington, D.C. right now. She's making sure the information is getting out, even if it's information that people don't necessarily want to hear. With the government on track to spend about $1 trillion more than it will bring in revenues over the next year, I think the alarm bell really needs to be sounded, and policymakers need to get to work on changing the trajectory of our nation's debt. So what is $1 trillion? It's about $3,000 per US resident per year is the deficit that we're now hitting. And in addition to working directly with Republican and Democratic members of Congress and candidates running for office, Maya's ideas and influence often shine through in the national press and in her own writing. She's a graduate of Northwestern University, although apparently learned about Stanford when her little brother came here as a freshman a few years later, and feels like maybe in hindsight would have preferred to come out here. So it is, but we better late than never that we got you here, and received a master's degree in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. She's worked on Wall Street as well as at the Brookings Institution, and I feel incredibly fortunate to have her with us here today, and despite the not exactly uplifting title of her talk, what is it? How $1 trillion deficits and the national debt symbolize our broken political system. I'm very much looking forward to all of her thoughts on how good economic policy could hold the promise for sunnier times. So please join me in offering a warm welcome to Maya MacGuineas to SIEPR.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a great introduction, and it's true. Like, I know when you hear that our organization's name is the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, that it is a laugh line. It is sort of a discouraging start to what we do. But I have also even charted out the course of the fiscal situation of the country over the 14 years that I've been running this organization, and it does not speak well to my performance. So I know all those things before you come up with that conclusion. And yeah, this is the most depressing topic that you could think of, because what I want to talk about is kind of the fiscal situation of where we are and why it matters, but also, as if that weren't a big enough, heavy enough lift, why it does reflect bigger structural problems I think we're having in our governance system right now. And yes, so I went to Northwestern, and I came to visit my little brother who was here at Stanford when I was a senior, and I just realized, oh, you don't have to be in 2 feet of snow for 7 months of a year. This place is beautiful. But I also have the same feeling when I come out to California now, which is not that often, but when I come here and I feel like what is going on in this coast is so exciting and so optimistic and so entrepreneurial, and there is such a sense of we can do anything. And meanwhile, back in DC right now, there is such a sense of we are so broken, we don't know how to fix it, and nothing is working. And it kills your soul. It is really hard, that environment. So the good news is we have decided, Chris Rotella, my colleague who is here, and I have decided, well, we're somehow bringing a West Coast chapter to this. I don't know what it's going to look like. Hopefully we'll connect with you guys, but we have to connect to what's going on and all the energy in this country, because what I'll talk about is these huge challenges that we have. And usually I am a really depressing speaker, and usually there is a joke about there should be drinks, so I'm so glad there are actually drinks. But all of that is in the veil of there's so much potential in this country. There's so much that we could be doing. And so what I'm going to talk about, let's try to see them as a few hiccups along the way to all the potential that I think is out here on the West Coast and other places in the country. So let me start talking about the fiscal situation and where we are. And like was mentioned, I came here as a political independent. I came to this issue. I sort of learned a little bit about budget deficits and then just became more and more concerned about them and worried that they were reflecting really short-term thinking and how we're doing economic policy. There are times that budget deficits are exactly right for the economy. There are times, it depends where you are in the business cycle. That's not how we use them. So just as a starting point where we are, the fiscal situation right now is the worst, as judged by debt relative to the overall economy, that it has been any time in our country's history other than right after World War II. So our debt relative to the economy is 77% of GDP. Historically in the country, the average is about 38% of GDP, and the average when we went into the recession of 2008 was 38% of GDP. And that's really important because it gave us the tools to respond to a fiscal downturn, which is why you want a healthy balance sheet. And I did say this once. I was on one of the Sunday morning talk shows, and I said, President Trump has inherited the worst fiscal situation of any president other than Truman. And oh my God, if you guys haven't dealt with a Twitter mob, It was a Twitter mob because so many people on the left thought I was saying it was all President Obama's fault. And that isn't what I was saying at all. In fact, I explained it, but there was like they tweeted out one little bit of what I'd said, and then people were furious, and I took a break from Twitter. It was really eye-opening about how those effects of social media can be. But what happened is, so President Obama walked into office and inherited one of the worst economic situations any president has ever inherited. And it was not what he ran on, it was not what his vision was, it was not his agenda, it was not what he wanted to focus on. But he was handed a terrible economic situation, very dangerous times, and had to figure out how to respond to that. And likewise, President Trump certainly did not run on dealing with the fiscal situation. We do something called U.S. Budget Watch during every election, and we analyze all of the candidates who are running, the promises that they've made in terms of their budget, and figure out what the overall fiscal effect would be. And again, my being a political independent is really important to me, and our organization is very bipartisan. Our co-chairs are Mitch Daniels, who was head of OMB and the governor of Indiana and runs Purdue, Tim Penny, who's an independent, a former congressman from Minnesota, and Leon Panetta, who is out here and has served in basically every position in government. And so many of the members of our board are very partisan or of different parties, but I'm independent and the whole group is bipartisan. And so when we have looked and evaluated different candidates when they've been running, it's always been a little nerve-wracking because we didn't want it to look like we were being political. And so far, not this past election, but the two before that, it turns out that the candidates who are running actually were very similar in what their fiscal promises were. Their policies were very different, but their overall effects on the bottom line were very similar. Not this past election. So this past election, there was no comparison. The promises that Donald Trump made were by far the most fiscally irresponsible of any of all the candidates, and would have added about $12 trillion to the national debt if they'd all been implemented as they were put in place. Now, the second most fiscally irresponsible was Bernie Sanders, who it's interesting because he actually tried to pay for a bunch of his policies, but it didn't cover nearly the huge expansion of government he would talk about. But it was the first time that we'd encountered a situation where one candidate was much more prone to deficit spending than the others. And that's the candidate who's the president. So I tell that story just to say this was not President Trump's agenda. He did not walk into office saying, what I really want to do is deal with a fiscal deficit. Obama didn't want to deal with an economic downturn. But the numbers are such that it cannot be ignored right now. So the starting point is as bad as it's been, other than right after we fought a world war, with the difference that we haven't just fought a world war. But it's not just that's the troubling part. The troubling part is where we're headed. So after World War II, the debt very quickly came back down to historical levels. The economy grew very quickly. Baby boomers were in a working part of their career, and that helped fuel the economy. And we recovered from that fiscal situation really quickly. We are now on track that we're going to borrow another $12 trillion over the next 10 years. And that's going to put us on track so that at the end of a decade, this debt that's 77% of GDP is projected to be about 100% of GDP. So quickly, we're now moving into uncharted territory. So it's not just that where we are is bad, which it is, it's that we're on track for things to be so much worse. And I think so the definition of unsustainable in the fiscal world is that our debt is growing faster than the economy every single year. We're about to hit trillion-dollar deficits. We had those once before, but we were in a huge, huge recession. The crazy thing about these trillion-dollar deficits is that they are self-imposed, that our deficit will be much closer to a couple $100 billion, but we've just passed a whole lot of legislation in the past years. So next year's deficit, over 50% of it will be legislation that we've passed by the last Congress. So we have doubled what our deficit will be. And I think probably most startling is that the fastest growing part of the federal budget right now is interest payments on the debt. And so that really is the most unsustainable piece of it. Okay, so interesting side story. Well, you should never start by saying interesting story, because if you think it's not, that was bad. So here's a story. We did polling because we very much thought that we were going to find out that the thing that made people care about this issue the most was their kids and grandkids, and that there'd be a whole lot of sympathy for that. One of the reasons that I thought that was in a very unkind experience when I was starting my career, I guess 15, 20 years ago when I was starting the career in the fiscal world, somebody dial tested me without telling me, where you have those lines that are going up or down. And so they dial tested me, and there were all these lines plummeting. And they sent me this photo, and they said, it turns out that when you talk about the deficit and the debt, you're highly unlikable. And like, I don't know if you've ever gotten a letter like that in the mail when you didn't ask, but you're like, that's mean and uncalled for. And it turns out they were trying to get my business, and they said, but we're going to give you all the tips to be more likable when you're talking. One, never talk about actuarial balance, okay? And two, you got to hold up photos of your children. And right? And I was like, well, actually, I don't have kids. 20 years ago, I didn't have kids. I don't have kids. They're like, doesn't matter. Fake kids are fine. But only to us. So that's the kind of advice you get when you didn't ask and you find out you're unlikable. But so I did poll, and we thought that we should do more messages on the intergenerational issues. Turns out people actually don't care about their kids or grandkids. One reason may be, we were just talking about this, I'm just entering the world of having teenagers. I'm stopping caring about them too, I get it. But I'm told I will care about them again in a few more years. But it turns out, so that was my story, back to my point, that the thing that people do care about, the thing that really concerns people is interest payments. And a big part of that is that so much of the borrowing, about half of our borrowing is from overseas. It's become more troubling to people when they realize that a lot of the borrowing that we have is from countries that aren't economically aligned with us. And so there's a vulnerability that comes with all of this. So the fiscal situation is our debt is at near record levels. It's headed to grow to close to unprecedented levels. And it's clearly, even in a low interest rate environment, clearly having an effect because the fastest part of the budget is interest payments. So then the next question, and the thing that we've always grappled with this organization is, who cares? Why should you care? And a lot of people really don't care. And so I think that there's a whole lot of reasons that it matters. The start is how it affects your economy. And so we know that once you become overly indebted as a nation, it's going to slow economic growth. And we have huge growth challenges right now in this country because we're facing the headwinds of a major demographic shift. So with the aging of the population, because what grows your economy is changes in your labor force and changes in productivity. Productivity has slowed down. We all hope that that will improve, increase, but we don't have as much control over that as we like. But what we know is that going forward, the labor market, growth of the labor market is only going to be 1/4 of what it's been in the past decades going forward because of the aging of the baby boomers. And one thing we really should be working on is how to age more productively in this country and how to encourage people to stay in the workforce longer in ways that they can. So we have fewer people collecting entitlements and more people working for a longer time. But so when you have high levels of debt, that slows your economic growth just at a time where what this country really needs is a comprehensive economic growth plan. And that would have lots of different policies, including immigration reform, regulatory reform, tax reform, infrastructure reform, spending more on investment than consumption, but also a debt deal. One of the best things that you can do to help contribute to growth is having kind of a sustainable debt path that we don't have right now. So the second thing is those interest payments that we talked about. And again, I realize these are not the things that create million-man marches, like these why people should care about it. People understand them, but they do not connect very passionately, but they really have a huge effect on our economy. The growing interest payments, of course, just means there is a pie that we will always be fighting about. No matter what divides Republicans and Democrats, there will always be a fight over whether we should be spending more or less, taxing more or less. But if a growing piece of that pie is growing interest payments, and since it's going to triple over the next 10 years from $300 billion to $1 trillion in interest payments, that just means a smaller pie to fight over, and nobody's going to think, oh, great, that's a great use of our money, those interest payments. I think for me right now, well, I guess there are a lot of reasons I worry about the most, but the big one that a lot of us are worrying about is the fiscal space issue, which means if you have a toolbox, when your economy turns down, you have monetary policy and you have fiscal policy. And as I said, when we went into the recession last time, fiscal policy was in much, much better shape than it is now. We were able to have a huge stimulus package, a big stimulus package. Some people would have said it should have been bigger. Many people would say it was the wrong stimulus. Just like Republicans and Democrats will always fight about the budget, they will always fight about what stimulus should look like. But you want to have the ability to respond to the recession. And there's been work that's been done recently that says we have plenty of fiscal space. Even if we do have fiscal space, which means we could borrow without pushing up interest rates if there's a recession, there is more likely to be a perception that we couldn't and we shouldn't. So if your debt is already too high, we go into a recession, it's quite likely that we will under-respond on the fiscal front. And so you've really depleted both the monetary and the fiscal toolboxes. That is a precarious situation that we shouldn't be in. And I keep going back in my mind to, it's just so self-imposed. We had such an ability to get our fiscal situation under control as the economy's strong as it has been right now, and instead we went in the other direction. There's the risk of fiscal crisis. It is much less of a risk in this country than anywhere else because we have the unique situation of being the safe haven, meaning we can screw up the global economy and people come back and buy our debt. And that's a very lucky position to be in, but it's also kind of a very enabling position. So because that's happened, we don't, like other countries have gone through major fiscal turnarounds where when their debt got too high, they knew they had to come up with some consolidation plan because otherwise they'd be punished by markets. The fact that markets won't punish us really enables us to borrow more. So it seems like a great thing to have. It is if you use it wisely, but in fact, we kind of let it make us more irresponsible. So the risk of fiscal crisis isn't immediate, but you can't have debt growing faster than your economy forever. Nobody has any idea when that runs out, but what I just don't understand is why it feels like we're actually intent on finding out. Okay, so another story, maybe good, maybe not that good, but this is true. I went to a dinner party and some guy said, you know, I've always wondered about these invisible dog fences and like, what do they feel like? Before we could stop him, he had strapped on the dog collar and walked outside to the invisible fence. And it was a horrific sight. Like apparently they're very painful. He fell over. It was horrible to watch it. It never cleared it from my mind. But to me, it has always stuck in my head of like, why do we have to find out what will bring a fiscal crisis? Like, why is that? Why do we need to know how the dog fence feels? And why do we need to know when a fiscal crisis will actually happen? We have no idea when it will be, but there's absolutely no reason we should be pushing it so that we can find out. And the one thing we know, and so the last point, why you should care, and the one I think that is so much more important these days than I would have said 5 years ago even, but there are so many changes going on in our economy. And again, out on the West Coast, you feel it all the time, and you feel it in this exciting, incredible way. But there are so many changes structurally to the point where lots of people are questioning whether capitalism is going to work going forward. But whether it's, you know, every big trend from work and globalization and data and technology, all of them mean we should be thinking what our budget looks like. There is no way that the appropriate budget is the same one that we had 50 years ago. And yet our budget is basically something we've put in place 50 years ago. Our major entitlement programs, retirement benefits for all of us, regardless of need, healthcare benefits, the focus is all at the end of life. So if you look at the federal budget, we spend $7 on people over 65 for every one we spend on people under 18. This is not reflective of what I think most people could agree on, which is this is a moment we need to be massively investing in human capital. And that with the pace of change being as quick to change as it is these days, we're going to be needing to constantly update what our social welfare system looks like, what our investment system looks like, and how we create a nimble economy where government is there to partner with the private sector as the private sector is fueling so much change. And I just look at this as this tremendous lost opportunity. We spend 84% of our budget on consumption rather than investment, so it is so consumption heavy. We're not thinking about any of the kinds of investments that really could help us be poised to take advantage of all the changes that are going along. Okay, so just now to segue into why, and we'll talk, I think, in the discussion part. I want to hurry because I'm much more interested in the discussion part. But we'll talk about sort of what's been going on in Washington more recently. But bottom line, we've been making things a lot worse. But I really have come to see, after doing this for such a long time and having watched moments where we were very close to getting debt deals, and there's been a lot of bipartisan cooperation at different times, and there used to be a stronger understanding that even though Republicans and Democrats would fight, ultimately they had to come to some agreement with some fiscal constraints. It's like all of that is out the window. And I really have come to see that the debt feels to me like a reflection of how broken things are in government and in Washington, more than I've ever seen. It is a strange experience to be a political independent, particularly in Washington right now. I've never felt so ideologically homeless, except that I feel that so many other people are ideologically homeless too. But certainly in DC, where it is a city of two camps, you feel it all the time. And sort of the whole sense of like, if you disagree with you, then you must be evil. Like there is no kind of openness and interest in other perspectives right now. But in a bunch of different ways, I think this represents what's going on in Washington so much in that right now, politics is definitely trumping good economics over and over again. So the political desirability of talking about we're going to create new spending programs and we're going to give you huge tax cuts is so much more appealing than we have an excessive debt problem. We're going to have to make a lot of policy choices to get us back on track. We're all going to just disagree on those policy choices, but we're going to have to figure out some kind of compromise to get us there. So political motivations much stronger than economic motivations. And you should hear all of our leaders justifying why it's the other party's fault. I mean, it is the things they tell themselves in the mirrors to sort of sleep at night over this. I'm not quite sure how they find them believable. The focus on short term rather than long term is huge. So right now, we have a lot of stimulus in the economy at a period in the business cycle where we didn't need it. And we had high growth last quarter, 4.2%, and we'll probably have high growth for another quarter. But we will also probably come down from that sugar high, that excessive stimulus at a time when the economy didn't need it, in a way that that makes the next recession more painful, that has bigger cleanup costs than it would have otherwise. So we're so focused on the immediate, the short term, instead of long term and sustainable. When it comes to problem solving, I think the best example is there should be no question that we have to make changes to Social Security and Medicare. They are unsustainable. They have trustees that talk about how they're unsustainable every year in the annual report. That does not mean there's one way to fix them. There's plenty of ways to fix them. And in fact, to go to the basic fight of taxes versus spending, take Social Security, you can fix it all with spending cuts. You can fix it all with tax increases. You can do what I think we should do, which is something in between. But we should not be delaying fixing it, which is what we're doing right now. And so one of the problems that's going on is the political parties and the leaders, I really fault political leadership in a lot of ways, but the interest of the parties is almost more in keeping problems and pandering and demagoguing than it is actually in solving those problems. Parties look at these problems as to their political advantage and running against them, scaring people that someone's going to hike your taxes or slash your Social Security, instead of actually fixing those problems. And then the final point I would make of sort of how this reflects governance challenges is that responsible budgeting, and again, there's nothing close to the right answer on this. There's a million ways the government could be bigger, it could be smaller. Fiscal responsibility isn't about smaller government. It's about not borrowing for all of your government. There's tons of different sizes and shapes government could be and be responsible. But it does require budget constraints. If we're going to do something, how are we going to pay for it? Are we going to cut other spending somewhere else? Are we going to raise taxes? Confronting the trade-offs. That's what budgets actually do. I'm not sure if everybody knows this, but we don't even have a budget in the country right now. We're about to end the fiscal year. We're going to pass the appropriations bills, about half of them. That's like really impressive. Everybody is patting themselves on the back. We're not going to shut down the government. But people are barely noticing that, one, we still don't have a budget in place. We're doing this without an actual budget. And two, the reasons we're passing appropriations bills is because we just busted budget caps we had by $180 billion. So we greased the wheels pretty generously. But instead of using these budget constraints, we are in an era of fiscal free lunchism. And you have people telling you, don't worry, this policy will pay for itself. No, it will not. This policy is way too important to be bothered by paying for it. That's exactly wrong. If something's really important, we should do it and we should pay for it. But I just look at this kind of, it's politics over economics, short-term over long-term, consumption over investment. We'd rather have the problems than solve the problems. And we would rather spew free lunch justifications than kind of deal with the trade-offs and the budget constraints that are part of budgeting. So, as if it weren't hard enough to fix the debt, and it's really hard because there is very little appetite for it on Capitol Hill, in the White House, or across the country right now. If it weren't hard enough, we've been giving more and more thought about what are we actually going to do to help figure out the root causes that have led to so much divide in the country right now that is reflected in kind of how we can't get anything done, how so many people feel like government's not reflecting their interests or solving problems or functioning in much of on a daily basis, certainly at all. So now, if it's okay, we'll segue into a discussion where hopefully all the optimists who I feel like have all come to California can give us ideas for a path forward. Thank you.
Over
Okay,
there.
great.
So I'll ask my 2 or 3 questions and then open it up and then maybe come back and ask another one or two. So be thinking about questions that you have. But as you sort of look ahead, so right now it's about $1 trillion, and this like 3,000 per person, I sometimes feel like is a useful way
It
to
is
talk
to
about it.
like
'Cause $1
put
trillion
these.
just is like, what does it mean?
Yeah, I think we have to do a better job of framing this in terms of numbers that we could identify with. So the per person, per household numbers.
Right.
Yeah.
Like one person that I remember doing a good job, we talked about this a little bit earlier. So I remember the year 1992, because in 1992, I was graduating with my electrical engineering degree from MIT, and I was entering a PhD program in electrical engineering. I'd never taken any economics or politics. I was like tunnel vision, engineering, math, science, all this stuff. And there was this presidential campaign going on at the time that I, started paying more and more attention to because I'm thinking about what am I going to do with my life? Am I going to go be an engineer or what? And I started to get really interested in it. And that presidential campaign started me on this path of taking an econ course when I was in my first year of engineering grad school, which ended up leading me to go to econ grad school. But it's interesting because that was the year when this person who we were talking about earlier, Ross Perot, popped onto the scene. And I remember these sort of charts and graphs that he would put out and sort of talk about it somewhat in moral terms, the deficit. And you said that people didn't care about their kids. Well, I guess I was someone's kid. Like it felt to me then,
I'm sure some of you
like
care about your kids.
it felt to me then like that message resonated with people in a way that maybe it hadn't previously. I hadn't been following the issue. My advisor in grad school was Marty Feldstein, and he had worked for Reagan, and Reagan did a lot of great things. But one of the things, the deficit went up a lot under Reagan, and Marty had kind of pushed back on that and so forth. So I hadn't paid that much attention to it before 1992, but I started paying attention to it, and it seemed like that it became much more salient to people in a way that I feel like somewhat set the stage for a set of policy changes that made a dent in the deficit. So I guess my first question to you is, for the nation do we have to wait for a crisis, or is it plausible that someone in Congress or some presidential candidate could get people more motivated? Because I completely agree with you that the deficit now seems to be even concerning people less. So anyway, thoughts?
Yeah, so one of the problems in terms of how it's concerning people less is that it's so big. So if we have $1 trillion deficits, now the mindset is, oh, well, we could just borrow $100 billion because we already have $1 trillion. So the fact that it's gotten so big, instead of scaring people, is making it more like just commonplace. And like you said, those numbers mean nothing, but people are more accepting of it. So yes, I think that's exactly right. We have spent a lot of time strategizing, whiteboarding, trying different approaches on this issue to get people engaged. And if there's one lesson I'm pretty certain of, it's that this will have to come on the agenda from on top. Now, to quote Leon Panetta, as he always reminds us, it will happen, and it will either be from leadership or crisis. So the crisis model is becoming more and more likely. But for the leadership model to work, which I still hold out some hope, I do think it has to come from on top. And because I've watched members of Congress incredibly willing to do this. With the Gang of Six, anybody who paid attention during the SimpsonBowles effort, and the Gang of Six, there were 6 great senators who worked so hard on this, and many more in the House. And those 6 senators ended up having 80 senators who were willing to put forth a grand bargain and vote for it. And really what happened, both Obama and Boehner had negotiations and they broke down, but also their political leaders in the Senate really weren't invested in them succeeding. So I've watched how you can't get this done without leaders. But to get the support of the country, this is a head nodder issue. It is not one where you'll wake up one day and say, oh my God, I'm terrified about the deficit. But if somebody who you trust is out there talking about it, you're like, you really can't have interest being the fastest growing part of the debt. And $1 trillion, that seems like a lot to be borrowing. So I do think a Ross Pro type model will be necessary. The question is who. Now, I will say that I went to see Ross Pro a number of years ago because I decided we needed to get him back in the business. So I wrote a note and said, can I come down and visit? And he said, okay. He had those charts. This was a while ago. He had those charts. They were literally scotch taped on the wall. They were like not behind any, glass or anything. So he showed me those charts. That was cool. This is really a while ago. And he had these great horse statues, which cultured people probably know Remy's or Remingtons. One's a gun and one's a horse. Remingtons, very valuable. I thought one was an armrest. So I just went like this on what is apparently a very valuable horse statue. So bottom line is he said,
Kicked you out of your house?
no, he said, no, I'm not coming back and saving the country. So I tried to get him to come back on the issue. He was very focused on education policy instead. But it was neat to see those charts because it had influenced me when I was listening to all of those things. We're going to need somebody who is going to do exactly what he did, which is take two politicians who are going in opposite directions, which is clearly where we're headed, and put an issue that cannot be ignored back on the agenda. And this, I'll tell you one thing, the media is very ready to be back on this. So last time in the presidential debates, I think we were so proud of ourselves because there were like 4 or 5 questions where they said, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget says your plan would do this, or this is how big the deficit would be. We were really excited to be quoted, but still we were completely ignored as the candidates just blew through those things. But I do think it will be too hard to ignore it going forward. And so if you have a candidate who talks about it and the media who really pushes on the issue, I think the biggest challenge that there is in 2020 is it's going to be so crowded, and there's so many things going on in the country right now that are all very serious, and the divides in the country are, scary. We need to figure out a way to unite this country again and get to where we can problem solve. So it won't be the only issue that's taking up oxygen, but I think it has that other advantage of it's going to be harder to ignore.
Right. So it is hoping that it's not the crisis
Yeah.
that leads, right, that there's someone at some point, the timing is just right, the person is, able to inspire people to want to take this on. So if we look at 2019, the projections from CBO, I just printed this out, the most recent budget and economic outlook. So the
I love a talk where someone comes with a CBO table.
Right.
So it's so great.
Love CBO. So the at least the tables. So the revenues are projected to be 3.5 trillion, and expenditures to be 4.5 trillion. So that's the $1 trillion deficit that you're talking about. So, and that, that number is, I think on the order, the spending is about $14,000 per person in the US in terms of what the federal government is spending. So if you, looking ahead realistically, and we also, so that's with unemployment projected to be 4%, that's given the demographics that are in effect in 2019. So over the next 17 years, we're going to have about a 60% increase in the 65 and up population and about a 6% increase in the 20 to 64 population, which is so obviously somewhat challenging. So when you try to forecast, given all that you've seen, to the extent that there is an adjustment, is it going to come more on the side of spending or is it going to come more on the side of taxes? What's your hunch on how that will shake out?
So it's interesting. When we worked on this 8 years ago, and thought there was going to be a big budget deal, the fair balance that people kind of were able to compromise on, and this all came from big bipartisan negotiations, was spending cuts of $3 for every $1 of tax increase. That's where the balance was. That's not going to work anymore. And again, like everybody has their different preferences. Because we have let more time go, and it is much easier to put tax increases into place quickly than it is spending cuts, particularly if you're talking about Social Security and Medicare, where you cannot say to my dad, guess what, your Social Security benefit is getting cut next year or not going up by as much as you would want. though he would be fine, yet he's the first guy to protest every time I'm out talking. He's like probably out there with a sandwich board right now. But he does,
Oh, that's awesome.
yeah, that. Um, but but I think as time has gone by and more of the baby boomers have moved into retirement, which is such a huge lost opportunity because it means they won't be part of fixing these, the ratio is going to have to be more revenue to spending. So ultimately, what I think is the compromise will probably, and I do this, so we have something, a debt simulator called the Debt Fixer. So anybody who wants to come up with their own solutions, please go to our website. So much fun on a Friday night. Play the Debt Fixer with your friends. Figure out how you would fix it. Send us your results. But we really do actually share all the results that people come up with members of Congress. I think it's probably going to be closer to 50-50 to start with. It may even be more tax heavy to start with, but more of the spending cuts are phased in more gradually, and so then it goes to more spending over time. So if you look at the first 3 years, it'll probably be more tax heavy, and then if you look at the next 10 years, closer to equal, and the second decade, it'll be much more on the spending side. That's not my preference. My preference doesn't really matter. If you want to know my preference, it's to do more on the spending side, but to protect all the low-income people and the public investments and take that spending out of programs. So I'd rather have a smaller government, but a government that does less for people who don't need as much. So I'd call it a smaller but more progressive government. But I think the window of opportunity was lost for that. The flip side of this is I think everybody loses in this negotiation. I think ultimately a budget deal will have more revenue than spending reductions that goes into it, but not more revenue for the really important things we should be doing. I'd like to be talking about lifelong learning. I'd like to be talking about all sorts of different programs that help people in transitions from their careers so that we can think about how you jump from one job or career to another and that you have financial security for the period of doing that. I think we'll have a lot more revenues that goes to government, but it will go to all of our benefits in retirement, which won't be the best use in my mind. So it won't be to protect the vulnerable, it won't be for public investments. So Republicans won't be happy because there'll be more revenue, and Democrats at least shouldn't be happy because that revenue is not going to what their priorities should be. So I think this is like the prisoner's dilemma gone bad. I am so uplifting.
Awesome. That's so great. I feel
what else can I be cheery about?
So in terms of, like, you talk about somewhat more progressive government. So one thing you hear economists who think about these big programs like Social Security and Medicare especially talk about is the possibility of moving to a system of more means testing, which is to say if you're super high income throughout your working years and then you basically, and there's an element in which Social Security's formula is somewhat, you get more back, at least if you live as long, if you're lower income than if you're higher income, but higher income people live longer. So there could be a lot of money saved if you were to move towards means testing. Now it depends. The devil's in the details. If you only make people who earn more than $1 million a year and eligible for benefits, you're not going to save anything. But you can imagine dialing that down to 500 to 200, well, whatever the number is, or phasing them out. Do you see that as something that people in DC, I don't know, could get behind, could champion?
So I'm a huge fan of means testing. I believe that it absolutely makes sense. Now, it's not perfect in incentives because you want to create incentives for people to save more for retirement. If you then say we're going to punish you for saving more, it's perverse incentives. There's a lot of problems with things like that. But overall, I definitely believe you could have, it's replacement rates. So the richer you are, your replacement rate could be lower. I think that makes a lot of sense because what I would prefer to have is systems of real insurances. I really think what we need is an insurance. It's the age old, like you don't insure your house against painting, you insure it against fire, or cleaning your gutters, you insure it against fire. So I'd rather have insurances that the government or private sector creates that are for real risks, long-term disability. There's so many things that we need to be worried about risk-wise. But whenever I go around the country and talk, everybody asks about means testing. Everybody's a fan of it. But Washington, not at all. And it's interesting, it's actually more unpopular on the left. And the reason is because a lot of people on the left feel that if you turn it from a universal benefit that everybody's a part of, the support for it will go down. So I think that's not a sound argument. One, the highest growth in programs other than interest, has been EITC and Medicaid. So those are targeted programs, and they have been popular, and the growth has been high. So there has been political support. But two, I don't think it makes sense to bribe people to support a program by paying benefits to people who don't need them when you need those resources for people who actually do need them. So kind of funneling someone who doesn't need it paying more into Social Security and getting more out, which all that does is have a deadweight loss of being inefficient, instead of finding ways to have those resources go to a better need. I think given constrained resources, there are better uses of it. Most people in Washington are not huge fans of it. But another thing that we should be thinking about is raising the retirement age. When Social Security started, the retirement age was 65, life expectancy was 62. So this was a program that structurally was likely to work out. Now, they should have realized that when the first recipient, whose name was Ida Mae Fuller, lived to be 100, this was like a little sign that, I know I'm not supposed to say actuarial balance because it makes you unlikable, but that the actuaries can get it wrong. So we know, I mean, the retirement age is gradually going to 67. We're living much, much, much longer. So I also think raising the retirement age is something we should be talking about, also highly unpopular. Guess what? Nothing that makes the fiscal situation better is popular.
Right, right.
There's really
Right.
few of these. But I find means testing is the thing that people in town halls across the country are most interested in talking more about.
I mean, means testing, you could argue, so one of the criticisms you'll hear of raising the retirement age or the eligibility age is that life expectancy has gone up a lot
Different.
more for high-income
Yep,
people
yep.
than it has for low-income people. And so to the extent that if you're going to raise the retirement age across the board, let's say from 67 to 70, that the person at the 20th percentile of the income distribution, that may hit them really hard relative to someone who's at the 95th percentile. Whereas the means testing, so I don't know, that is one of the things. So
that to me is a terrible situation that doesn't mean we should not fix Social Security. It means we need to figure out why these life expectancy differentials, which come from health and stress, I mean, that's a problem about income inequality. That's a bigger, deeper problem that we need to be figuring out about how we're going to have a sustainable economic system that I think is more important than any of these other issues in many ways.
So let me open it up now for some questions from the audience. So let's start with David right here.
First of all, Maya, I'd like to thank you for being here. It's great to have you. And I think, I agree 100% with what your group is doing, what you're doing and trying to do. I'm a fiscal conservative, but we do have our broken political system. So I'm going to throw out a couple of, and I'm a fiscal conservative, but I'm going to ask a question that might be a little difficult. What if we don't have a crisis? What if we just monetize the debt? And then the second question I have for you, and by the way, I'm not advocating that. I'm just asking the question as a way of avoiding the crisis. The second question is, what if we take a different approach towards fixing our broken political system and we try to actually crowd out the bad spending with good investment spending? So instead of trying to talk about all the ways that we can try to cut the deficit, we try to advocate programs and ideas that are actually good for the country. So big spending ideas that are actually good as a way of having politicians in Washington look at options, how they're going to advocate their spending, given there's no appetite in DC to cut spending.
So what's a good program? Infrastructure?
Infrastructure. Everyone can get behind infrastructure even though nothing's happened.
Okay, so to the first question, of course, if you monetize the debt, what you're doing is you're evaporating a lot of wealth. So it's something that looks more costless than it actually is. I think it will be tempting to do that to some extent, but it will have, there is no free lunch in the economy, and so it will have real effects on people who have saved money, and it becomes worth much less. It was tempting for a while. There was a big paper out of the International Monetary Fund actually recommending that we do that, or that we consider it as a piece of it. And my guess is that that will be tempting, but it shouldn't trick us into thinking that it isn't without costs. Of course, has costs. Yeah, and I know you're not saying do it, but you're right, more and more people will say that. The search for the free lunch is never ending, and it will always happen. What worries me about your argument, I like, could you push out bad spending, but I don't really know what is bad spending. I mean, people, none of the things that we do are bad spending. So the problem is more productive spending is generally public investments or things that aren't productive but you think really matter, depending on what your beliefs about welfare, some level of welfare that you really want, some safety net. But public investments are the most productive spending, but the least popular, because what people really like is checks. They really like it if you send the money, and that's why we love our tax break. So when I talk about cleaning out the tax code, one of the best things, I mean, there are two great tax reforms we could do. We did part of one. Oh God, California, I am going to get killed. But
Here we go.
the home mortgage interest deduction, people, not good tax policy. I should just run out, right? Like, I've only gotten one death threat, and it's when I wrote an op-ed. I know. Sorry,
Not so
I'm
happy.
kicked out of here. But the home mortgage interest deduction has renters subsidizing homeowners, and it subsidizes the housing market, and it's why the lenders and the builders love this policy. So, but it is the one death threat that I got was when I wrote this op-ed about getting rid of the home mortgage interest deduction. And the other is the healthcare exclusion. One of the biggest reasons we have spiraling healthcare costs is because we subsidize greater and greater demand for insurance, which insulates us from the costs, drives up healthcare costs. When you talk about getting rid of tax breaks, people love it. When you talk about those specific things, not so popular. And the same thing comes when I'm sure that half of you, when I'm talking about changing Social Security, are like, wait a second, I did pay in. And it's true, we all did pay in. Now, we also are, because we've lived so long, are going to live long, are going to get much more out of Social Security than we paid in. And one idea I've always liked is someone said your Social Security check should start to be in like red when you're starting to take out more than you paid in, just so you realize. But the problem is, I think a lot of the policies that many people might say would be good for the government to do wouldn't be the popular ones. So if it is, it's investment in human capital in many ways, I think is the most important thing we could be doing. But what I do think we need that's related to what you're saying is a budget constraint. It's pretty simple, but some kind of spending cap, and there's no right level, but some constraint where you have to say, do I want to do this spending on defense or foreign affairs or energy policy or Social Security or Medicare or veterans benefits or government pensions? No value on those, but let's try to weigh the trade-offs between them. If you don't have a budget constraint, if you just say, well, we can just borrow to do that for everything, then everything seems like a great deal. But if what you're doing is saying you're trading it off versus things, you're comparing it to something else, that's how you start making choices. And I think that's one of the things we have to bring back to basic budgeting, which is the notion of trade-offs and constraints.
Irina. And then over here, who is? Okay,
so California has really tried to lean against the cyclicality of the economy. So California has built up massive budget reserves, and at the same time, the federal government has tried to shift more of the costs of some of these entitlement programs to the states, and through the last tax bill also capped the ability of certain states to raise revenues. So under these circumstances, what would you recommend that states such as California would do?
She works for the state of California.
Sorry. This is a self-interested question.
So we sort of disagree on that state and local tax deduction, don't we? That's
don't
another
like
one
this.
that's,
You don't.
I think it's great that we capped it. So, well, but
You're in California.
I know, sorry, God, way to make yourself unpopular, I'm sure. I think we're going to see more and more of this. The federal government, one of the easiest things to do is going to be to say we're taking a lower share of these things and pushing it back on the states. But one thing, I'll push back a little bit. Why is it impossible for states to, why should the federal government be raising more revenues instead of the states raise more revenues? This is a real question. Like, it's always assumed that, oh, well, we can't raise that money at the state, so we need to do it at the federal level. But since a lot of people would prefer states to be making more of their own choices, why wouldn't we think about raising revenues at the state level to pay for those things? So, but I don't hear that argument in DC. Nobody else seems to think that. I think what will happen is that you will see more and more bottom line of this passed on to the states, because it's going to be the cost sharing ideas that the federal government has engaged in that they'll pull back from. And there'll be promises of like, we'll give you incentives to pay for something for a couple years, Medicaid, and then it's going to slow down over time. So that would be my prediction. The way that states and federal government finance things and figure out healthcare and education benefits is so nonsensical. It reminds me of kind of my graduate school days where I almost wish we could just go back and start from scratch and figure out how to divide the responsibilities of where you raise the revenues and how you decide how to spend them.
Okay, we've got 2 more questions over here, and then we're going to, Barnaby.
A couple things. Can I ask a question and then make a couple suggestions?
Great.
So the question is your group, so you're nonpartisan. Do you guys come up with suggestions of a solutions to the problems? You've detailed in your talk all the problems and the challenges and the whys it's gotten to the point where it is.
Should I answer that and then you'll give
Yes,
suggestions?
please.
So the answer is yes, and there's the reason is I really don't want to be a whiny negative group that's always saying don't do this, don't do this. And we were saying, you know, the fiscal skunk at the party. But when I've worked in different places before and people are so excited and they come up with great new ideas of things to do, and I always come in the office and I'm like, how are you going to pay for that? And they kind of slam the door. Nobody's that excited to see me coming when I'm always the wet blanket on great new ideas. But part of what I think is incumbent on somebody who does this is to think about, there's lots of great things we should be doing. How could you pay for it? Again, either from other spending cuts or tax increases. So yeah, we have these huge option lists that we send out to members of Congress all the time of, here's $4 trillion in savings that you could put together. Actually, that's not even sufficient because it would take $7 trillion to balance the budget over 10 years right now, which is probably too aggressive a goal. But we come up with tons of options. And about, I guess, 8 years ago, I came out with a colleague and we wrote a whole plan on how to fix the budget, just because I felt like it was important to be willing to go forward. If you're not in political office, it's much easier to say these things. So we thought it was important to put forth an idea like that. And so Galston-McGuineas plan was out there. And I've done the same thing on Social Security with somebody from the Clinton administration, Jeff Liebman, and somebody from the Bush administration, Andrew Samwick. The 3 of us did a Social Security plan on how to fix it also. So yeah, we do try to focus on the solutions as often as possible, but with options, so we don't always say there's only one way to do it.
Okay, so here's a couple suggestions. You mentioned SimpsonBowles, and when they came up with their plan, I don't know all the details of it, but I remember that it was spread across kind of broadly and evenly across, so everybody felt
exactly,
the pain,
yeah.
which is too bad that it wasn't put into effect.
Sure is.
When I first got out of college, my first job it was a computer company. We had a saying called "managing the 1%."
It was called what?
Managing the 1%. The idea is you tweak a little bit here, and a little bit here, and a little bit here. You raise prices a little bit, like taxes, and you lower this spending here and here, and you go through. So my thought is, rather than trying to take one piece at a time, you actually put together the whole list of all of the spendings, all of the budgetary spendings, and say how everybody could, if you just tweak it a little bit so no one's feeling great pain, those 1% drop to the bottom line. And so if you did that and you talked about things that are less extreme or not very extreme changes, you might find it's more palatable. But you need to be able to, I think, show the whole picture, to be able to go across all things so everybody is seeing the big picture.
Okay, so that's maybe can we take the last question, or did you have an answer for that? Answer?
Answer.
Quick.
So that's exactly right about SimpsonBowles. That the beauty of it, amongst other things, was that it was a little bit from everything, and so everybody felt like they were part of. Everybody was treated fairly. It wasn't just all in one area. And there is an idea like that. And it's called the penny plan. And I like the idea of something like that. And it's just reducing spending by 1% every year. And you could also do it with also increasing taxes by 1% every year if you wanted to be on both sides. I like that because it's creating a budget constraint. What I don't like is when people pretend it replaces that there are actual policies involved. Like if you're going to actually make a difference, there will be real policies that are involved. So I love the budget constraint. Let's just take 1% out of every area. As Erskine Bowles always used to say, I never met a budget where you couldn't cut 10% and still be fine. 10% would be too much, but 1%, and I guess it's 1% a year in the penny plan, would be incredibly doable. I just don't want people to think it's just like the balanced budget amendment. You can like it or not like it, but it doesn't actually replace putting forth a balanced budget. So there's policy pieces to it too. But I think a time for a budget constraint like that's a good idea.
And we're going to go slightly over, but Professor Van Horn, yeah. Here we got a microphone right here. Microphone.
Michael Bloomberg hints about running as a Democrat. How fiscally responsible do you consider him? And do you wish to comment about any other Democratic candidates?
Good question.
Do you understand the question?
We may have had that discussion already. The two of us. So, yeah, so Michael Bloomberg, when I created a coalition outside of the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget called the Campaign to Fix the Debt, he was one of our 3 co-chairs. He's excellent on this issue. He really cares about it. He's a very good spokesperson for it. I think it'll be critically important to have somebody like him. It's the Ross Perot thing, but somebody like him who is credible out there talking about the issue. I'm really worried that Democrats are going to say, we don't care about this issue at all. We're so mad about the tax cut. We're not engaging in this. Nobody is going to talk about it. So Bloomberg is the person who most comes to mind who would use this as a big issue. I'm also, again, my never-ending independence. I like the idea of a unity ticket. I like the idea of one Republican and one Democrat running together on the issue. But I do think somebody like that who has real cred and real guts to stand up and talk about it will be critical. And I think he's serious about contemplating. I have no inside knowledge, but I think he's serious about contemplating a run for sure.
Okay, with that, we'll wrap up. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you.